Inside an upscale diner, my stepson sneered aggressively at a homeless girl begging for leftovers. "Get lost, you filth!" Trembling with intense fury. I quietly stood up to protect the small girl. The instant I noticed a birthmark on her neck, my heart stopped beating. Without saying a single word, I led her away. That terrible dinner was the exact moment a truth hidden for 15 years finally began to unfold. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. To help us connect, leave a comment below with the city or country you're watching from. Also, please note, this story includes dramatized elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to specific names or places is coincidental, but the life lesson remains deeply important. I was halfway through a plate of eggs and toast at Sam's diner when she walked in. I say walked in, but that is not quite right. She appeared in the doorway, the way people appear when they have learned to take up as little space as possible. Shoulders pulled and eyes down, reading the room before committing to it. She was young, 20, maybe 21. Her jacket was too thin for October in Oregon, and her boots had been resoled at least once by someone who was not a cobbler. She had the look of someone who had been outside for a long time and had stopped expecting that to change. She made it about 4 steps inside before Brett saw her. I did not know then what I know now about why Brett reacted the way he did. All I saw was my stepson come up out of his chair fast, the way a man comes up when he sees something that frightens him and decides that aggression is a better response than honesty. "You need to leave," he said. "Right now. You don't belong in here." She did not argue. She had probably learned that arguing was not worth the cost. She just started to turn, and something about the way she moved the set of her shoulders, the particular way she accepted being dismissed, like she had been practicing the acceptance her whole life, made me put down my fork. "She's staying," I said. Brett looked at me. I looked back at him. "I have been in Millbrook for 30 years, and I own the ground my workshop sits on, and Sam Greer has been my friend since before Brett Mercer was born, and all of that was in the look I gave him." Brett sat down. I pulled out the chair across from me and said, "Sit. Eat what you want. I've got more than I need." She looked at my plate, the eggs going cold, the toast. I had not touched the cup of coffee I had let go, lukewarm. Then she looked at me, trying to figure out what the catch was. "No catch," I said. "Just food." Her name was Gracie. She told me that when she finally sat down after she had eaten half the toast and all of the eggs I ordered for her, and a bowl of oatmeal that Sam brought over without being asked. She said it quietly, like a name was something you offered carefully to someone you were not sure you could trust. I told her mine. Warren Cole. Woodshop on the south side of town. She nodded and looked at her hands. I did not know, sitting across from her in Sam's diner on that October morning, with the Oregon rain coming down outside, and Brett Mercer staring holes in the back of my head, that I was looking at my daughter. I did not know that the last time I had seen that face it had been 4 years old and burning with fever in a hospital room I was not allowed to enter. I did not know that the particular way she held her coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, thumbs aligned along the rim, was the same way her mother had held a cup. I did not know any of that. All I knew was that she had not eaten in a long time, and I had more than enough. And that when she thanked me, her voice had the sound of someone who had not said those words to anyone in a while, and had almost forgotten how. I offered her a spare room at the shop for the night. She said I did not know her. I said that was true. She said I should not trust a stranger. I said probably not. She came anyway. That evening, I sat in the old wooden chair by the workshop window and listened to the Oregon pines push against the roof and looked at the thin line of light coming from under the door at the end of the hall. Her door. I have not slept in a bed properly in 15 years. But sitting there looking at that line of light, I knew that whatever had walked through my door that morning was not a coincidence. I just did not yet know what it was. The whole truth is that when she walked through the front door of the shop earlier that evening, she stopped. Just for a second. She pulled in a long breath through her nose like she was trying to hold on to something. And I know that smell. Sawdust and machine oil and the particular sweetness of Douglas fir when you split it fresh. I have lived inside that smell for 30 years. It does not mean anything to a stranger. It meant something to her. I do not know what to do with that. My wife Sarah died in the spring of 2008. Pancreatic cancer. She was 41 years old, and she went fast, which the doctors said was a mercy, and which I have never once believed. Fast is not a mercy. Fast is just a different kind of brutal. One morning she was making coffee and complaining that the percolator was taking too long, and 4 months later she was gone. Our daughter Gracie was 4 years old, after Sarah. I did not know how to be a father to a little girl alone. I knew lumber grade and load-bearing tolerances and how to read a grain. I did not know how to braid hair or explain why the sky changes, colors at dusk, or what to do when a child cries at 2 in the morning and cannot tell you why. Gracie used to crawl into my side of the bed and press her cold feet against my legs, and I would lie there staring at the ceiling, terrified I was going to ruin her. Diane Mercer showed up that fall. She lived 2 houses down, and her own husband had passed the year before, and she came over one Saturday with a casserole and an offer to watch Gracie while I got some work done. She was patient with Gracie in a way that looked like love. She laughed at the right moments. She folded laundry without being asked. By the following spring, I had convinced myself that I was not alone anymore, and by summer we were married. I was a fool, but I was a grieving fool, and grief makes fools of better men than me. The night I lost Gracie, she had been running a fever since morning. 103, then 104. Diane drove us to Millbrook General, and I sat in a plastic chair in the hallway while the nurses worked. Someone brought me a cup of coffee that tasted like rust, and I drank it anyway. The next thing I knew, a doctor was shaking my shoulder, and the hallway lights were too bright, and Diane was standing behind him with her hand over her mouth. They told me Gracie had passed. Cardiac complication from the fever. It happened fast. I have thought about that night 10,000 times. I have turned it over and looked at every edge of it. And the one thing that has never sat right, not once in 15 years, is this: I never saw her. They would not let me see her. Diane said it would be too hard, that I needed to remember her the way she was. And I was so broken open, I let a woman I had known for less than 2 years make that decision for me. I let her. I have not forgiven myself for that. After the funeral, I locked the small room at the back of the shop. Gracie's room. There was a little bookshelf in there, with 3 picture books and a wooden horse I had carved her the Christmas before, and I could not move any of it. I told myself I would deal with it later. Later became a month, then a year, then 15 years, and the room stayed locked, and I stayed in this chair most nights listening to the pines. Brett moved into the house the same week I locked that room. He was Diane's boy, quiet and watchful in the way of a kid who has learned to make himself small. I never warmed to him the way I thought I should. I told myself that was my failure, not his. Now I sit here looking at the light under that door, and I try to be a reasonable man. A reasonable man does not feel his chest go tight because a hungry girl stopped in a doorway and breathed in the smell of sawdust. A reasonable man does not spend 2 hours in a wooden chair in the dark because a stranger has the same cowlick above her left ear that his dead daughter had. A reasonable man does not call that anything other than coincidence. I push myself out of the chair. My knees argue about it the way they always do after 10 o'clock. I walk down the hall until I am standing in front of her door. On the other side, I can hear her breathing slow, and even the breathing of someone who has not slept somewhere safe in a very long time and is making up for it all at once. I press my palm flat against the wood. The grain is smooth under my hand. Red oak quarter sawn cut from a tree. I milled myself the winter Sarah was pregnant. I put this door up before Gracie was born. I don't know what you are to me. I say low enough that I am only talking to the door. But I am going to find out. I stand there another minute. Then I walk back to my chair, and I pick up the phone, and I scroll to a number I have not called in 2 years. Frank Kowalski, private investigator, former Multnomah County Sheriff's deputy, a man who has never once told me what I wanted to hear, which is exactly why I trust him. I type out a text instead of calling, because it is past midnight, and Frank has a wife and 3 kids who did not ask to be part of my problems. Frank, I need you. Tomorrow morning if you can manage it. It's about Gracie. I set the phone face down on my knee and look out the window at the Oregon dark. The pines are still pushing against the roof. The light under her door is still on. I do not sleep. But for the first time in 15 years, I do not want to. She was already up when I came out at 5:30. I found her standing in the middle of the workshop floor with her arms crossed over her chest and her head tilted back, looking at the ceiling the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize. The overhead lights were not on yet. The only light came from the east window, that thin gray Oregon light that arrives before the sun commits to anything. In it, she looked like she was made of the same material as the room. Like she had always been there, and I was the one who had just walked in. "You sleep okay?" I asked. She turned around fast, embarrassed to be caught standing still. "Yes, sir. Sorry. I was just—" She shook her head. "It smells good in here. I don't know how else to say it. It smells like something I can't remember, but I know it anyway." I did not say anything to that. I walked to the breaker box and flipped the overheads on and told her coffee was in the kitchen, and that she did not have to apologize for standing in my shop. Old Pete arrived at 6 the way he has arrived every weekday morning for the past 22 years, boots on the mat, thermos in hand, not a word to anybody, until he has checked the humidity gauge by the lumber racks. Pete Dawson is 68 years old, and he has more knowledge about wood in his left thumb than most men carry in their entire bodies. He has worked for Cole & Sons since I was 34 years old, and he was 46, and I had just bought the place from the previous owner and did not know half of what I thought I knew. Pete taught me the rest. He noticed Gracie the way Pete notices everything without appearing to notice at all. She was sweeping sawdust from under the bandsaw when it happened. Pete had set a draw knife and 2 chisels on the workbench and turned away to check a board he had clamped overnight. Gracie set her broom against the wall and picked up one of the chisels the way a person picks up something familiar. She turned it handle down and settled her thumb along the flat of the blade to test the bevel. Then she wrapped her fingers around the handle, not the way most beginners do, choking up high and uncertain, but down low, palm cupped under the butt thumb, riding the side for control. It is the way I hold a chisel. It is the way I have held one since I was 19 years old, when an old Finnish carpenter in Eugene spent 3 weeks drilling it into me and told me I would thank him later. I have never seen anyone else hold one exactly that way. Pete turned around and saw it. He did not move. He stood with the board in both hands, and he stared at Gracie's fingers wrapped around that chisel handle, and his face went the color of old ash. His mouth opened slightly and then closed again. "You done much woodworking?" he asked her. His voice came out hoarser than usual. Gracie set the chisel down quickly, like she had been caught taking something that was not hers. "No," she said. "I've never even held one of those before. I don't know why I picked it up that way. It just felt right." Pete looked at me across the length of the workshop. 22 years of working together will give two men a language that has nothing to do with words. What he said to me with that look was something I was not ready to hear out loud, so I turned away and told Gracie there was more coffee if she wanted it. I spent the rest of the morning pretending to sand a cabinet door that did not need sanding. It was mid-afternoon when I saw it clearly. Gracie was reaching up to pull a measuring tape from the shelf above the assembly table. Her shirt pulled up on one side as she stretched, and the light from the south window fell directly across her left shoulder blade. The birthmark was the size of a quarter, the shape of a maple leaf with 3 distinct points along the top edge and a narrow tail curving down toward her spine. My daughter Gracie had that exact birthmark in that exact location. I know because I used to trace it with my finger when she was a baby, and I was rocking her to sleep. And I needed something to do with my hands, so I would not fall apart from loving her so much. My vision went sideways. I grabbed the edge of the work table and held on until the room stopped tilting. Gracie pulled the measuring tape down and turned around, and I was already walking toward the office fast, because I needed 4 walls around me and a door I could close. I sat on the floor of my own office with my back against the desk, and I pressed both hands flat on the cold concrete, and I breathed through my nose until my heartbeat came down from wherever it had gone. Then I picked up my phone and I called Frank Kowalski. Not a text this time. A real call. He picked up on the second ring. "Warren, I was about to call you. Got your message last night." "Frank," I said, "I need you here. This morning. I don't care what you've got going on." A pause. The sound of a chair scraping back. That bad. I looked at the closed office door. On the other side of it, I could hear Pete talking to Gracie about the difference between hardwood and softwood, and I could hear her asking questions in that careful, hungry way she had, like someone who has been told her whole life that her questions are a burden and has not quite believed it. "I think my daughter is alive," I said. "I think she's standing in my workshop right now asking Pete Dawson about Douglas fir." Frank did not say anything for a long moment. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. Frank Kowalski drives a 10-year-old Ford pickup that sounds like it is perpetually annoyed about something. I heard it coming up the gravel drive before I saw it, and I stepped out of the office and told Gracie and Pete I had a business meeting and that they should take lunch whenever they were ready. Pete looked at Frank's truck and then looked at me and kept his mouth shut. That is one of the things I have always appreciated about Pete Dawson. Frank is 53 years old and built like a man who spent his 20s doing physical work and his 30s doing desk work and never fully committed to either. He has a gray mustache and a habit of listening with his eyes half closed that makes people think he is losing interest when he is actually paying the most attention. He was a Multnomah County Sheriff's deputy for 14 years before he went private. He finds people who do not want to be found and uncovers things that other people have spent a great deal of money to keep buried. In 20 years of knowing him, I have watched him be wrong exactly twice. He came into the office and sat down across from me and put his thermos on the corner of my desk and said, "Talk." So I talked. I told him about the night Sarah died and the way grief had left me so hollowed out that I could not think past the next hour, let alone make careful decisions about who I was letting into my home. I told him about Diane and how her patience had looked like love when I was too broken to know the difference. I told him about the night at Millbrook General, the plastic chair, the rust-flavored coffee, the doctor shaking my shoulder, and Diane standing behind him with her hand over her mouth. I told him they would not let me see Gracie's body, that Diane said it would be too hard. Frank's eyes were half closed through all of it. "You never pushed back on that," he said when I finished. It was not a question, and it was not an accusation. It was just Frank naming a fact. "No," I said. "I did not." "Okay." He uncapped his thermos and poured coffee into the lid and set it down without drinking it. "What changed yesterday?" I pulled open the top drawer of my desk and took out the photograph I had found in a box under the workbench. 3 years after Gracie passed, a snapshot I had printed from my phone the Christmas before she got sick. In it, she is wearing a red sweater and sitting on the floor of the workshop, surrounded by wood shavings, laughing at something I said. Her left shoulder is visible above the collar of the sweater. The birthmark is there, clear as anything. 3 points along the top narrow tail curving down. I slid the photograph across the desk to Frank. Then I told him about Gracie, the girl from yesterday, not the girl in the photo. The way she had breathed in the smell of the shop. The way she held the chisel. I described the birthmark I had seen on her shoulder blade in the afternoon light, and I watched Frank pick up the photograph and hold it at an angle and look at it for a long time without saying anything. "Same location?" he asked. "Same location, same shape, same size best I could tell." Frank set the photograph down. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and stared at the wall behind my head, the way he does when he is running through something internally. I have learned not to interrupt that process. "I need a name," he said finally. "The nurse on duty the night your daughter passed. You remember anything about her?" I had thought about this through the sleepless hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, turning over every detail of that night that I could still access. There was a woman who came out to the hall twice to update me. Dark hair, maybe 40-45. She had a name tag, but I was not in any condition to read it carefully. I pressed my fingers against my eyes and tried to bring the memory into focus. I think it started with an R. Ruth, maybe. I'm not certain. Frank wrote something in the small notebook he carries everywhere. "Last name, I don't know." He nodded like that was fine, like half a first name was plenty to work with. That is another thing about Frank, he does not perform frustration. I reached into the same desk drawer and took out the hairbrush I had lifted from the bathroom shelf that morning. Gracie had left it on the edge of the sink, and 3 dark hairs were caught in the bristles. I had folded it inside a clean piece of paper and taped the paper shut. "DNA," I said. "Private lab. I need it fast and I need it quiet." Frank took the folded paper from my hand. "In Oregon, collecting hair from an item someone has left on a shared surface is not a crime. It falls under the same legal principle as collecting a discarded coffee cup. A private DNA result cannot be used as criminal evidence on its own, but it can establish a foundation for civil proceedings, and it can tell me what I need to know before I say a single word to Gracie." Frank knows all of this. He has done it before. "I know a lab in Portland," he said. "Good people. 5 to 7 days, sometimes faster. Faster if possible." He stood up and put his notebook in his jacket pocket and picked up the folded paper carefully. At the door he stopped. "Warren, if this goes where I think it might go, you understand what that means for Diane." I looked at the photograph still lying on my desk. Gracie in the red sweater. Wood shavings on the floor. That birthmark above the collar. "I understand exactly what it means," I said. Frank left. Through the office window, I watched his truck back out of the drive. Then I pulled up the personnel database from Millbrook General on my computer. It was public record staff directories from 2009 were archived online through the county health system, and I typed the letter R into the search field under nursing staff. The third result stopped me cold. Ruth Hadley, registered nurse, Millbrook General Hospital, 2004 to 2010. Current status retired. I wrote the name down on a piece of paper and stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Frank back. Ruth Hadley, I said when he answered. That's your name. Frank called me at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock above the workshop door for the better part of 2 hours, pretending to inventory lumber, while Gracie and Pete worked at the assembly table 20 feet away. And when my phone finally buzzed, I walked out the side door into the cold without my jacket and answered it, standing in the gravel. I found her, Frank said. Ruth Hadley lived in a small house on a quiet street in Salem, about an hour south of Millbrook. Frank said the curtains were drawn on every window, and there was a portable oxygen concentrator visible through the gap in the front curtain. He rang the bell, and a woman in her late 50s answered the door in a cardigan and slippers, moving slowly. The kind of slow that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with the body, spending most of its energy on something more urgent than walking. Terminal cancer. Stage 4. Frank had pulled her medical records through a contact at the Oregon Health Authority before he drove down. Ruth Hadley had stopped treatment 8 weeks ago and moved to palliative care. When I told her my name and said I was asking on behalf of Warren Cole, Frank said, she started crying before I finished the sentence. I pressed my back against the cold exterior wall of the workshop and stared at the sky. It was the flat gray of an Oregon afternoon that cannot decide whether to rain. She talked, I said. It was not a question. She talked for 40 minutes straight, Frank said. And Warren, I need you to sit down for this part. I told him I was standing and that I would stay standing. Frank told me what Ruth said, that on the night of September 14th, 2009, a woman had come to her at Millbrook General with an envelope of cash and a proposition. The woman told Ruth that the child in room 7 had to disappear. Not just be discharged, quietly disappear. Told her there would be more money after, and that if Ruth ever said a word to anyone, the woman knew people who could make Ruth's problems considerably worse than they already were. Ruth had taken the envelope. She was in debt, and she was scared, and she was not, she told Frank, a strong person. She wanted Warren to know that. She was not a strong person, and she had done a terrible thing, and she had known it was terrible from the moment she agreed to it. But she could not hurt a child. When it came to it, standing in that room in the dark, with that little girl breathing under the blankets, running a fever, but breathing, Ruth could not do what she had been paid to do. Instead, she had wrapped Gracie in a spare blanket, carried her to her own car in the staff parking lot, and driven 3 hours to a children's home in Bend called St. Margaret's. She told the intake worker that the child had been found abandoned at a rest stop on Highway 20. She gave a false name. She left before the sun came up, and she drove back to Millbrook, and she handed in her resignation from Millbrook General the following Monday. She said her name, I told Frank. My voice came out wrong. Too flat, like all the feeling had dropped out of it. The woman who paid her, she said her name. Yes, Frank said. She did. I already knew. I had known since the moment Frank said the word disappear, because there was only one person in my life who had been standing in that hospital that night, and who had something to gain from my daughter ceasing to exist. Frank said the name anyway. Diane Mercer. I put my hand over my mouth. I stood in the gravel behind my own workshop, and I put my hand over my mouth, and I breathed through my nose until I was certain I was not going to be sick. Diane Mercer had paid a nurse to make my 4-year-old daughter disappear. And then she had come out to the hallway where I was sitting in a plastic chair, and she had put her hand over her mouth and told me my child was gone. She had practiced that face. She had stood somewhere and practiced the expression she would make when she told me. "There is something else," Frank said. His voice had changed. "Careful now." The voice he uses when he is about to hand someone a weight they did not know they were going to have to carry. "Ruth sent you a letter," Frank said. "In the fall of 2009, about 6 weeks after she left St. Margaret's. She said the guilt had already become more than she could manage, and she wrote out everything, what she had done, who had paid her, where she had taken the child. She mailed it to the shop, to Cole and Sons Millbrook." The gravel blurred under my feet. "I never got a letter," I said. "I know," Frank said. "She never got a reply. She assumed you had decided not to come looking. She spent 15 years believing you knew and had chosen to move on." I thought about every piece of mail that had ever come to the shop. Diane had handled it for years. She sorted it, stacked it on the corner of the kitchen counter, brought me whatever she decided I needed to see. "Frank," I said. My voice had gone very quiet. "She burned it." Frank did not argue with me. "That's what I think too." I stood in the gravel for another minute after we hung up. The cold had gotten into my shirt, and I could not feel my hands properly, but I did not move. 15 years ago, a dying woman had tried to give me back my daughter. She had put the truth in an envelope and mailed it to my front door. And the woman I had married had held it over a flame. I walked back into the workshop. Gracie looked up from the table where she was helping Pete clamp a joint. She took one look at my face and started to stand. "I'm fine," I said, which was the largest lie I had told in a long time. I went into the office and closed the door and called Frank back. "Get everything she has," I said. "The letter, the recording, the signed statement, all of it. I don't care what it costs." "Already on it," Frank said. "She has a recording, Warren. Audio. Diane giving her the instructions. Ruth kept it for 15 years in a fireproof safe." I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the kitchen after Gracie and Pete had gone, and I drank bad coffee, and I thought about Diane moving through my house for 15 years, opening my mail, sorting what I needed to see from what I did not, handing me bills and supply invoices and the occasional card from Peggy, and keeping everything else for herself. I had thanked her for it. I had told her more than once that I did not know how I would manage the paperwork without her. I had handed her the keys to every room in my life, and she had used them. Frank called at 8 the next morning. He had stopped at the Marion County Courthouse on his way back from Salem and pulled the property records for Cole and Sons through the county recorder's office. Public record. Anyone can walk in and request them. Frank had requested 15 years' worth. "Sit down, Warren," he said. "You keep telling me that," I said. "I keep not doing it." He told me about Mercer Holdings. It was registered as an LLC in Oregon in 2014. The registered agent was Brett Mercer. The business address was a post office box in Portland. Between 2015 and 2023, Mercer Holdings had entered into 6 land transfer agreements, with Cole and Sons agreements, that conveyed portions of the workshop property to Mercer Holdings in exchange for what the documents described as capital investment and operational support. The signatures on those agreements read Warren Cole. Frank had photographed every page. He texted them to me while we were still on the phone, and I pulled them up on my laptop and looked at my own name written in a hand that was not mine. The W was wrong. The way I make a capital W, both outer strokes come down at the same angle, and the center point sits low. These signatures had a W with uneven outer strokes and a center point that rode too high. I have signed my name on lumber contracts and vendor agreements and county permits for 30 years. I know what my signature looks like. These were not mine. Forgery, I said. Yes, Frank said. Signing another person's name on a real estate transfer document is a Class C felony in Oregon. Fraud on top of that. And here is the part that will make you need to hold on to something. The total land area covered by these 6 agreements is approximately 38% of your current property footprint. I set my coffee mug down on the table because my hand was not steady enough to hold it. 38%. I had built that property up over 30 years. I had bought the original lot with a loan. I spent a decade paying off. I had acquired the adjacent parcels one at a time, saving for each one, expanding the operation piece by piece the way you do when you are doing it right and not cutting corners. 38% of it had been quietly signed away in my name by a woman who had also 15 years ago signed away my daughter. There is more, Frank said. There is a 7th agreement. It is dated for execution in December of this year. It covers the remaining eastern parcel, the one with the kiln and the secondary storage building. If that agreement is executed and registered with the county, Brett Mercer will hold title to just under half of your total property. I looked out the kitchen window at the workshop. The lights were on inside. Through the glass, I could see Gracie moving along the lumber racks, running her hand along the edge of a board, the way you do when you are learning to read wood by touch instead of by sight. Pete had taught me to do that. He was apparently teaching her too. The registration has not been completed, I asked. Not yet. The agreements exist, but the county recorder shows no completed transfer of title. Diane needs either your signature on the final document or a legal mechanism to remove you from the equation entirely. A medical power of attorney, for instance, or a conservatorship if she could establish that you lack the capacity to manage your own affairs. I thought about the coffee mug in my hand going unsteady. I thought about the mornings I had woken up with my head full of fog and chalked it up to age. I thought about how many times in the past 2 years Diane had told me I seemed tired, that I was forgetting things, that maybe I should see a doctor about my memory. She had not been expressing concern. She had been building a case. Frank, I said, she does not need me dead. She just needs me incompetent. That is what I think, Frank said. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. Gracie had stopped at the end of the lumber rack. She was holding a narrow strip of cherry wood up to the light, the way you hold a thing when you want to see what is inside it, turning it slowly, watching the grain shift. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. Diane had tried to erase her once. She had paid cash to make that child cease to exist, and when that failed, she had built a 15-year plan to make sure that even if Gracie somehow reappeared, there would be nothing left to come home to. No father with his wits about him. No property worth inheriting. No Cole and Sons. Just Brett Mercer holding title to land that was never his in a name that had been forged from mine. Send me everything, I said. Every page, I want it all. Already sent, Frank said. Warren, the DNA results should come back within the week. Once we have those, we need to talk about next steps carefully. Diane does not know we are looking. That is an advantage we cannot afford to lose. I watched Gracie set the cherry strip back on the rack, perfectly aligned with the others, the way someone does when they have been taught to respect the materials. She had not been taught. She just did it that way naturally. I know, I said. We do this right. After I hung up, I stood at the window for a long time. Then I went outside and told Gracie and Pete that I was taking lunch orders because it was the only useful thing I could think to do with my hands. 3 days after Frank sent me the property files, Diane made her move. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary as any other. Pete had come in early to check on a glue-up he had left overnight, and Gracie was in the kitchen making oatmeal on the stove, stirring it, the way she did everything with more attention than the task strictly required, like she was still not entirely convinced that food would continue to be available if she stopped paying close attention to it. I had noticed that about her, the way she finished everything on her plate, the way she never left a cup half empty. Diane came into the kitchen at 7:30, with her coat already on, keys in hand, moving with the particular efficiency of a woman who had somewhere to be and wanted everyone to know it. She looked at the stove, then at Gracie, then at me. "Warren, you look exhausted," she said. "You need your morning tea." Before I could answer, she had the kettle on and the canister of loose-leaf tea down from the cabinet, the same tea she had been making me for the better part of 2 years. Earl Grey, she always said, though it never tasted quite right to me. I had mentioned that once, and she had told me my palate was getting dull with age. She poured the water and let it steep and set the mug in front of me on the kitchen table. And then she looked at Gracie and smiled, the way a person smiles when they want to appear generous and harmless simultaneously. "I have to run some errands," Diane said. "Would you mind keeping an eye on him? Make sure he finishes that. He never drinks enough when I'm not here to remind him." Then she was gone. Her car backed out of the drive, and the sound of it faded down the road toward town. Gracie stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand and looked at the mug on the table and did not say anything right away. I watched her face. Something had shifted behind her eyes, a sharpness, a focusing, the look of someone running a quiet calculation. "Go ahead and eat," I told her. "Don't let it get cold." She brought her bowl to the table and sat across from me. I lifted the mug and drank from it the way I always did, because I did not yet know what I know now, and because Diane had been making me that tea for so long that refusing it had never once occurred to me as an option. 20 minutes later, my vision began to blur at the edges. Not dramatically, not the spinning room and the dropping to the floor that you see in movies. Just a soft dimming at the periphery, like someone had turned the contrast down on the world by 30%. My hands felt heavier than they should. When Pete came in from the workshop to ask me a question about a delivery order, I found that I had to concentrate harder than usual to track what he was saying, and by the time I answered him, I had already half forgotten the beginning of his sentence. Pete looked at me for a moment, with an expression I could not quite read. Then he went back to the workshop. Gracie had not touched her oatmeal. She was watching me with her hands flat on the table, and her eyes moving over my face in a slow, methodical way that I recognized, though I could not have said from where. It was the look of someone taking inventory, checking systems, looking for a pattern in a set of symptoms. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "I'm fine, just tired." She reached across the table and picked up my mug. She turned it in her hands, smelled it, set it back down. Then she got up and went to the cabinet under the sink and came back with a small glass jar that had held pickles once rinsed clean. Without a word, she poured the remaining tea from my mug into the jar and screwed the lid on tight. "What are you doing?" I asked. "At St. Margaret's," she said, keeping her voice level and practical. "We had a unit on medication safety. Basic stuff, overdose recognition, interaction symptoms. What certain drugs look like in behavior versus what they look like on paper. There was a woman at the shelter I stayed at last winter who was being given something without knowing it. Her boyfriend put it in her coffee every morning. She held the jar up to the kitchen light and looked at it. The way you just tracked Pete's words, the edge blur, the heaviness in your hands. I've seen that before. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Gracie," I said. "I'm not certain," she said quickly. I could be wrong. I want to be wrong. She set the jar on the counter and took out her phone and typed a short message. I have a friend named Nina. We grew up at St. Margaret's together. She works near a clinic in Portland that does private lab testing. No names, required cash payment results in 48 hours. She looked at me steadily. Will you let me send this? I looked at the jar on the counter. I looked at the mug sitting empty in front of me. I thought about every foggy morning in the past 2 years. Every afternoon I had spent convinced I was simply getting old. Send it, I said. She pressed send and set the phone face down on the counter. Then she picked up her bowl and started eating her oatmeal, which had gone cold, and did not complain about it. We did not talk about it again that day. There was nothing to say until we had something to say. But that evening when Diane came home and offered to make me another cup of tea after dinner, Gracie got up from the table and said she would take care of it, and brought me a cup of chamomile from a box she had bought herself at the drugstore in town that afternoon. Diane watched that exchange from the kitchen doorway for just a moment too long before she turned away. The lab called on a Thursday morning, 5 days after Frank sent the sample. I was running the table saw when my phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. I shut the saw down and pulled off my safety glasses and looked at the screen. Portland area code. A number I did not recognize. My hands did not shake. I want to be clear about that. My hands were completely steady when I answered, which told me something about how far past fear I had already traveled. Mr. Cole. A woman's voice, professional and unhurried. This is Dr. Callahan at Pacific Northwest Genomics. I have results on file number 4732. Is this a secure time to speak? I walked out the side door of the workshop into the cold morning air and pulled the door shut behind me. Through the window, I could see Pete at the assembly table and Gracie sweeping sawdust from the far corner, her back to me, earbuds in, moving the broom in long, even strokes. Go ahead, I said. Dr. Callahan told me that the DNA comparison between sample A, the hair follicles from the brush, and sample B, a cheek swab I had provided from myself 3 weeks prior, showed a biological match consistent with a first-degree paternal relationship, 99.9% probability. She kept talking after that. Something about the report being available for download through the patient portal, something about follow-up options if I needed additional documentation for legal purposes. I heard the words, but they moved through me like water through river rock, present then gone, 99.9%. I put my back against the exterior wall of the workshop, the same wall I had stood against when Frank called from Salem, and I slid down it until I was sitting on the cold ground, with my knees up and my phone loose in my hand. The gravel pressed through my work pants, and I did not move. Above the tree line, the Oregon sky was doing what it does in October, cycling through 4 different kinds of gray in the space of 20 minutes, unable to commit to any single version of itself. I had a daughter. She was inside my workshop right now, sweeping sawdust, wearing earbuds, moving a broom in long, even strokes like she had been doing it her whole life. She had been doing it her whole life. In shelters and church basements and wherever else she had found to sleep, she had been doing the practical, unglamorous work of surviving, and she had done it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, and she had done it alone. And she had done it because 15 years ago, a woman I trusted had handed an envelope of cash to a nurse in a hospital hallway and told her to make my child disappear. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, and I sat on the cold ground, and I let it move through me. All of it. Every morning I had woken up in a house that felt too large. Every meal I had eaten at a table set for the wrong number of people. Every time I had ordered an extra plate at Sam's Diner without knowing why, and then sat there looking at it like it was accusing me of something. She had been out there the entire time. The side door opened, and Pete stepped out. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, the real kind from the pot in the office, not the powdered stuff we kept for visitors. He looked at me sitting on the ground, and he did not say, "What are you doing down there?" or "Are you all right?" or any of the things a person might reasonably say upon finding a man sitting in the gravel behind his own workshop at 9 in the morning. He sat down next to me, on the cold ground in his good work pants without being asked. He held out one of the mugs, and I took it, and we sat there together and drank our coffee and looked at the tree line while the Oregon sky made up its mind about the rain. After a while, Pete said, "Good news or bad news?" "Good," I said. "Best news I have ever gotten in my life." He nodded once slowly, the way he nods when a piece of wood turns out to be exactly what he hoped it was going to be. Then he finished his coffee and pushed himself to his feet and went back inside without another word. I sat there another few minutes. Then I stood up, brushed the gravel off my pants, and walked back into the workshop. Gracie had moved on from sweeping. She was at the hand tool bench organizing chisels by size the way I had shown her 2 days ago, setting each one in its slot with the blade facing the same direction. She pulled out one earbud when she heard me come in. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Getting there," I said, which was the truest thing I had said in 15 years. That evening, my sister Peggy called from Portland. We talk maybe once a month. She has her life and I have mine. And the distance between Millbrook and Portland is not just the hour and a half on I-5. But she called that Thursday evening, and something in my voice must have reached through the phone and grabbed her by the collar, because she went quiet in the middle of a sentence about her neighbor's fence dispute and said, "Warren, what is going on?" It was not a question. "I can't tell you yet," I said. "Not on the phone. But Peggy, do you remember after the funeral you told me you didn't believe it? You told me something was wrong, and I told you that you needed to let it go." A long pause. "I remember," she said quietly. "You were right," I said. "You were right, and I am sorry it took me this long to say so." She did not ask me anything else. She just said, "I'm getting in the car," and hung up. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked out at the workshop where the lights were still burning. Through the window, I could see Gracie at the bench, still working in no hurry to stop. I had a daughter. She was 21 years old, and she organized chisels by size, and she did not waste food, and she had figured out in 20 minutes what I had missed for 2 years. I needed to tell her. Not tonight. Not until I had spoken to Frank and thought through every step of what came next, but soon. Before another day passed that she did not know, I called Frank at 9 that evening and told him the results were in. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When are you going to tell her?" "Tonight," I said. "I cannot wait another day." Frank told me to be careful about what I revealed regarding the investigation. "Tell her the truth about who she is," he said, "but hold back the details about Diane and the nurse and the property records until we were further along and had everything locked down." We needed Diane to keep believing she was safe for a little while longer. One wrong word, one change in Gracie's behavior that Diane noticed, and 15 years of careful maneuvering would have a chance to disappear down a drain. I told him I understood. Then I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the hallway that led to the back of the workshop where her room was. The bookshelf was still in there. 3 picture books and the wooden horse I had carved the Christmas before everything fell apart. I had not moved any of it in 15 years because I could never decide whether moving it would mean I had accepted something I was not willing to accept. Now I walked down that hall and knocked on her door. She opened it in about 4 seconds, which told me she had not been asleep. She was still dressed, sitting on top of the covers, with a library book open face down on the bed beside her. The room smelled like sawdust, and the cedar soap from the bathroom down the hall, and the lamp on the nightstand, threw a circle of warm light across the floor that just reached the feet of the bookshelf in the corner. She looked at my face, and whatever she saw there made her step back from the door without being asked. I came in and sat down in the wooden chair by the window, the one I had put in that room before she was born, for the nights I sat up with her when she would not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap and waited. She was good at waiting. She had probably spent most of her life doing it. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything, because if you stop me in the middle, I am not sure I will be able to start again." She nodded. So I told her. I told her about Sarah and the spring of 2008 and the 4 months that went from percolator complaints to a grave marker with her mother's name on it. I told her about a little girl with a birthmark shaped like a maple leaf who used to press her cold feet against my legs at 2 in the morning. I told her about the night in the hospital and the plastic chair and the coffee that tasted like rust and waking up to a doctor shaking my shoulder. I told her I had never seen the body, that I had let someone else make that decision for me and spent 15 years not forgiving myself for it. She had gone very still on the edge of the bed. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the photograph Gracie in the red sweater, wood shavings on the floor, that birthmark clear above the collar. I held it out, and she took it with both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then I took out the folded lab report and set it on the bed beside her. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the report. She looked at the bookshelf in the corner, at the 3 picture books with their broken spines, and the small wooden horse on the middle shelf with the chipped ear I had never gotten around to repairing. "I carved that the Christmas before you got sick," I said. "The ear chipped when you threw it across the room because you wanted the blue one instead of the brown one." I had to stop for a second. "You were 4 years old, and you had very strong opinions about horses." A sound came out of her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but somewhere in the middle where those 2 things live right next to each other. She pressed the photograph against her chest with both hands and bent forward over it, and her shoulders started shaking, and I got up from the chair and sat on the bed beside her because there was nothing else to do. She turned into my shoulder the way a person turns toward warmth when they have been cold for a very long time. I put my arm around her, and she grabbed the front of my flannel shirt in both fists and held on like she was bracing against something. And I held on back, and neither one of us said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying right then that words were going to do justice to. After a while, she pulled back enough to look at me. Her face was wet, and her eyes were red, and she looked more like her mother than I had let myself notice until that moment. "I always thought I remembered a smell," she said. Her voice was unsteady, but she pushed through it. "Sawdust and something like oil. I thought I had made it up. I thought it was just something my brain invented, because I needed something to hold on to." "You did not make it up," I said. "No," she said, "I didn't." The front door of the workshop opened and closed. Footsteps on the concrete floor, steady, purposeful, the walk of someone who has covered a lot of ground quickly and is not done moving yet. Then Peggy appeared in the doorway of the room, still in her driving coat, car keys in her hand, her hair pushed back from a 90-minute drive down I-5. She looked at Gracie. She went absolutely still. "Those are Sarah's eyes," she said. Her voice cracked straight down the middle. "Warren, those are Sarah's eyes." Gracie looked at me. I looked at Peggy. And then my sister crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled my daughter into her arms and said her name, her real name, the one she was born with for the first time in 15 years. She was already at the kitchen table when I came in at 6 the next morning. Peggy was there too, still in yesterday's clothes, her driving coat folded over the back of a chair. She had a mug in both hands, and the particular look of a woman who had not slept but was not going to admit it. Between them on the table was a plate of toast that someone had made and nobody had touched. I poured myself coffee and sat down, and the three of us stayed like that for a moment, not uncomfortable, just adjusting to the shape of something new. 15 years of a certain kind of quiet, and then one Thursday night, and now this. A kitchen that held the right number of people for the first time in a very long time. "I need to tell you something," Gracie said. She was looking at her coffee mug, turning it slowly in her hands. "About why I ended up on the street. You should know the whole thing, not just the parts that make me look like a victim." "You do not have to do that this morning," I said. "Yes, I do." She looked up. "I need you to know who you are dealing with before you decide what I am worth to you. That is how it has always worked for me. Get it out early so nobody is surprised later." It hit me somewhere behind the sternum, that sentence. The matter-of-fact way she said it, like presenting her liabilities up front, was just a reasonable business practice she had developed out of necessity. I wanted to tell her that was not how this worked, that she did not owe me an accounting of herself. But she needed to say it more than I needed to stop her, so I nodded and let her talk. His name was Derek Sloan. She had met him in her second year at the community college in Bend, 18 months after she aged out of St. Margaret's. He was 24 to her 19, confident, in the way of men who have figured out that confidence is most effective when aimed at people who have never had anyone believe in them. He had told her she was smart. He had told her she was going somewhere. He had told her that the two of them together could build something real. What they built, it turned out, was a debt. I had come to her over the course of 8 months with paperwork, business loan applications, vendor agreements, a lease on a commercial space in Bend for a landscaping operation he was supposedly starting. He explained each document patiently. He told her his credit history made it necessary for her name to appear as co-signer, that it was a formality, that she would never actually be liable for anything. She had signed because she trusted him, and because nobody had ever before asked her to be part of building something. He left on a Tuesday in March. No note. His number disconnected by noon. The commercial space was empty. It had been empty the whole time. Just a lease in her name for a property he had used as a mail address to process the loan applications. The total debt load across 6 different lenders came to just over $40,000. She lost her enrollment at the college when she could not make the tuition payment. She lost her room in the student housing when she could not make rent. The debt collectors found her within 60 days. 2 of them represented lenders connected to people Derek apparently owed money to, separately, people who sent someone to her door twice before she stopped answering doors. "I stopped using my name after that," she said. Lily Harper instead of Gracie. It was the name from St. Margaret's, the only other name I had. I moved every few weeks. I learned which shelters did not ask for ID, and which churches left their side doors unlocked in winter. She finished her coffee and set the mug down precisely in the center of the table. "He took everything I had," she said, "which was not much, but it was mine." I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. 21 years old. $40,000 of fraudulent debt. 2 years of sleeping in places without locks. And she was sitting in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, telling me her liabilities up front because she had learned that was the responsible thing to do. "Derek Sloan," I said. "You know where he is now?" "No," she said. "I haven't heard from him since March of last year. I hope I never do." I nodded, and did not say what I was thinking, which was that Frank Kowalski was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. Peggy reached across the table and covered Gracie's hand with hers and did not say anything, which was exactly right. I was reaching for the toast when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Frank. 3 words and a question mark. Derek Sloan. Millbrook. I pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Out on the road, in front of the property, nothing moved. Just the October light coming through the Douglas firs and the gravel drive running straight to the workshop door. I typed back, "What do you know?" Frank's reply came in under a minute. Someone in the Millbrook Community Facebook group had posted a photograph 2 days ago, the exterior of Cole and Sons, caption reading that old Warren Cole had taken in a young woman and she was helping out around the shop. 3 people had commented. One of them had tagged a location. The post had been shared 11 times. Derek Sloan had a Google alert set for Gracie's name. The name she had used at the college, the name on the debt paperwork. Gracie Harper. It had taken him 48 hours to find the post, make the connection, and locate a phone number for Diane Mercer. My phone buzzed again. He called her last night, after 10. They talked for 22 minutes. I stood at the window with my back to the kitchen and kept my voice level when I said, Peggy, would you take Gracie out to the workshop and show her the kiln Pete should be in by now? Tell him I said to walk her through the whole drying process." Peggy looked at me over the rim of her mug. She understood. She pushed back her chair and said, "Come on, you're going to want to see this part." And Gracie followed her out without asking why I was staying behind. I waited until the workshop door closed. Then I called Frank. "How bad?" I said. "Bad enough," Frank said. "But we knew this was coming. The question is whether we get ahead of it or let it come to us." It arrived on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after Frank's text about Derek. I found it when I came out to unlock the workshop at 5:45, a standard white envelope, no return address, no postage, hand-delivered sometime in the night, and pushed through the gap between the workshop door and the frame. My name was on the front in block letters printed from a computer, the kind of printing that tells you nothing about the person who typed it. I stood in the cold, with the envelope in my hand for a moment, before I opened it. Inside was a single photograph printed on standard copy paper. It showed Gracie sitting across a table from a man I did not recognize, late 20s, dark jacket, the kind of unremarkable face that is designed to be forgotten. They were leaning toward each other in the way of people mid-conversation. Someone had written across the bottom of the image in red marker, "She knew who you were before she ever walked through your door." I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and unlocked the workshop and turned the lights on and stood in the middle of the floor in the dark that was becoming light and tried to think clearly. The thinking clearly part was harder than it should have been. I had noticed it, building over the past week, a thickness in my mornings, a lag between what I intended to do and what my hands actually did. I had been careful about the tea, or I thought I had been careful, but Diane was patient, and she was practiced, and there had been 2 mornings when I had come into the kitchen already exhausted and sat down at the table, and she had placed a mug in front of me before I was awake enough to refuse it. Gracie had been watching. She had taken the mug both times, but the damage from the weeks prior was cumulative. The way Gracie had explained it to me, the drug did not clear your system between doses. It built, and even without fresh doses, the residue of 2 years sat in my blood like sediment at the bottom of a river. By 8 that morning, I was moving through the day the way a man moves through shallow water. Present, functional, but slower than I wanted to be, and aware of the slowness in a way that frightened me. Diane came into the workshop at 8:30 carrying a travel mug she said was coffee. She set it on the corner of my workbench and said I looked like I needed it. I thanked her and did not drink it and moved it to the far end of the bench when she turned away. She was there for 11 minutes. I counted. She looked at Gracie 3 times, each look lasting about 2 seconds, the look of someone taking measurements. After she left, Pete appeared at my elbow. He picked up the travel mug, walked to the utility sink in the corner, and poured it down the drain without comment. I did not stop him. The phone call came at 2 in the afternoon. A man's voice I did not know, older, hesitant, with the particular cadence of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is nervous about getting it right. He told me he did not want to get involved, but he felt I had a right to know. He said he had seen Gracie 2 weeks ago at a coffee shop in Portland, sitting with a young man, and he had overheard them talking about a wood shop in Millbrook and a man with money and how patient they would have to be. I hung up before I could ask him anything. I sat in the office with the door closed and the photograph on the desk in front of me and the residue of 2 years of small poisonings sitting in my blood, and I tried to hold what I knew against what I was feeling. What I knew was a lab result that said 99.9%. What I knew was a girl who had pressed her cold feet against my legs at 2 in the morning and demanded a blue horse instead of a brown one. What I knew was Pete Dawson going white in the face when he saw how she held a chisel. What I was feeling was a door in my chest swinging open onto nothing. I picked up the photograph again. The man across the table from Gracie, dark jacket, forgettable face. I looked at the angle of the light in the image, the way it fell across the table from the left side. I looked at Gracie's hands, both flat on the table, shoulders straight, the posture of someone sitting across from a person they do not particularly want to be sitting across from. That was not the posture of a woman in a planning session with a partner. That was the posture of the woman who had learned to hold herself very still when she felt threatened. I knew that posture. I had been watching it across my own kitchen table for weeks. I put the photograph face down on the desk. My head was pounding with a low, persistent ache that I recognized as the drug working on me, pressing on my reasoning, the way a thumb presses on a bruise, not disabling, just constant, just enough to make everything cost a little more than it should. I needed Frank. I needed him to tell me what he had found, and I needed him to tell me tonight, because I could feel the ground shifting under my feet, and I did not entirely trust my own footing. I pulled out my phone and called him. "The envelope arrived," I said. "I know," Frank said. "I've been working on the source. Give me until tonight." "Tonight," I said. "Frank, she's going to figure out something is wrong. She watches everything." "I know she does," Frank said. "That is actually going to work in our favor. Keep the photograph. Do not let Diane know you have it. And Warren, do not drink anything she gives you, not a drop." I looked at the travel mug Pete had already emptied down the drain. "Already handled," I said. That evening, Gracie brought me a mug of chamomile and set it in front of me at the dinner table, and Diane watched that small transaction from across the room, with a face that had gone very careful and very still, the face of someone recalculating. I did not sleep well that night, and I woke up worse than I went to bed. That was the drug. I understood that in the abstract, the way you understand something that is happening to you while you are too inside it to see it clearly. Gracie had explained the cumulative effect, and I had nodded and believed her, and then spent the next 12 hours being slowly convinced by a fog I could not name that maybe I had been wrong about things, about everything, about the photograph and the posture and what I thought I knew about my own daughter. By 7 in the morning, I had talked myself most of the way to a place I did not want to be. Diane made breakfast. Eggs and toast, orange juice poured before I asked for it. the performance of a woman who has been a wife for a long time and knows how to look like one. She did not bring me tea. She was too careful for that now. But she had been careful about other things the night before. I found out later that she had added a small amount to the orange juice carafe which sat on the counter overnight, which I poured myself a glass from at 6:45 before anyone else was up. So by 7, I was sitting at my own kitchen table feeling like I was thinking through wet cement and looking at a photograph of my daughter with a man I did not know, and trying to remember what it was I had decided about that photograph, and not quite being able to get there. Gracie came in from the workshop, where she had been in since 6, the way she always was, the way I had started to count on. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, and looked at me with the direct, undefended look she had, the one that still surprised me sometimes, and said, "You don't look right this morning." "I'm fine," I said, which we both knew was not true. "Warren." She set her coffee down. She only used my first name when she was about to say something she needed me to hear straight. "Something is off. You've been off since yesterday afternoon. Is it the photograph?" And there it was. The opening I had told myself I would not walk through, and I walked through it anyway. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to be straight with me." She went very, not the stillness of guilt, but the posture of someone who has learned to brace for accusations. "The man in the photograph," I said, holding up the printout. "Is that Derek Sloan? A caller said they saw the two of you in Portland talking about taking over this shop." Something moved across her face that I did not have the clarity to read properly. She picked up her coffee mug and held it in both hands and looked at me for a long moment. "And you believe that?" she said. It was not a question. "I don't know what I believe," I said. "I'm trying to know." Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that had gone rigid. Don't finish that sentence. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to be fair. You're trying to give me a chance to explain myself." She set the mug down on the counter. Not hard. Carefully, the way she set everything down. "But what you're actually doing is telling me that a piece of paper with some red writing on it and a phone call from someone you have never met counts for more than what you already know." "Gracie, don't." She walked out of the kitchen. I heard her bedroom door not slammed, just closed firmly with intention. I sat at the table and stared at the orange juice glass and the photograph and the wreckage of the last 5 minutes, and tried to think through the cement in my head. 3 minutes later, she came back. She was carrying the small duffel bag she had arrived with. She set it on the kitchen floor and went to the hook by the workshop door and took down the spare key I had given her on her second day and came back and placed it on the kitchen table next to the photograph. She looked at me and her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she looked exactly like her mother in the moment before Sarah said something that was going to be true and was going to cost both of us something. "I don't need your workshop," she said. "I don't need what's in it or what it's worth. I have lived without those things my entire life, and I know how to keep doing it." Her voice held steady all the way through. "But I needed a father. That was the only thing on the list. And if you cannot be that, if a piece of paper and a stranger on the phone is enough to make you forget what you already know, then I cannot stay here and wait for the next piece of paper." She picked up the duffel bag. The fog pressed down on me, and underneath it, fighting up through the wet cement and the residue of 2 years and the orange juice. I should not have poured something else pushed back, something that did not live in my reasoning mind at all. The way she held a chisel, the smell of Douglas fir in her hair after a day in the workshop, the wooden horse with the chipped ear on the middle shelf of the bookshelf I had never let myself empty. I was on my feet before I decided to stand up. "Gracie." My voice came out louder than I intended, rough in a way I could not smooth. Stop. She stopped at the kitchen doorway, her back to me, the duffel bag in her right hand. I crossed the kitchen in 6 steps, and I came around in front of her because I needed her to see my face when I said it. I was wrong, I said. I know I was wrong. I can feel the difference between knowing something and knowing something, and what I have known since the first morning you picked up that chisel is not something a photograph puts a dent in. My voice broke on the last word, and I let it break. I am sorry. That is not enough, and I know it is not enough, but it is what I have right now. She looked at me for a long time. The duffel bag was still in her hand. Then she set it down on the floor. She did not ask me why I had doubted her. That was the first thing I noticed. After she set the bag down, she did not demand an explanation, or an accounting of my reasoning, or a better apology than the one I had given her. She just stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, with her hands loose at her sides, and then she looked at me the way she had looked at me the morning after the DNA results, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand, rather than things she had already judged. Then she said, "Come outside." We stood on the gravel behind the workshop in the November cold, far enough from the house that no one inside could hear us. The Douglas firs were doing what they do in November, holding their dark green against a sky the color of old pewter, indifferent to the season, in the way of things that do not shed. "Hold out your hands," she said. I held them out. They were trembling. Not the fine tremor of cold or nerves, but something deeper, a vibration that seemed to come from inside the muscle rather than the surface of the skin, like something in my nervous system was trying to send a signal and could not quite get it through. Gracie looked at my hands for a long moment. Then she looked at my eyes. She reached up and put 2 fingers against the pulse point below my jaw, the way someone does who has been taught to take a reading and trust what they find. "How much did you have this morning before I came in?" she asked. "Orange juice," I said, "from the carafe, before 6:30. She pulled her fingers back and pressed them against her own mouth and looked at the tree line and pulled in a slow breath through her nose. "She poisoned the carafe," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I drank a full glass before 6:30, I admitted. "That's what caused the fog," she urged gently, looking into my eyes. "The drug was clouding your judgment, making you suspect the very person trying to help you. It wasn't your heart doubting me, Warren. It was the chemicals. Something in my chest unlocked at that. Something I had not known was locked." Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, and whatever she saw there made her close her eyes for just a second, the way a person closes their eyes when something they were hoping for turns out to be true. "Nina," she said. She turned the screen toward me. The message was a photograph of a lab printout. The sample label read, "Coal Kitchen Sample A." The date was 3 days prior, and the result field showed a single line of text, positive. Lorazepam. Concentration consistent with repeated low-dose administration over extended period. Lorazepam is a benzodiazepine, a class of prescription sedative used to treat anxiety and seizure disorders. At therapeutic doses, it produces calm. At the low chronic doses Diane had been administering, delivered daily over months and years, it produces something more insidious, a slow erosion of confidence, a softening of memory, a persistent fog that the person experiencing it attributes to age or stress or grief because they have no reason to look for any other explanation. It does not make you stupid. It makes you uncertain. It makes your own mind feel like unreliable ground. I had been standing on unreliable ground for 2 years, and I had thanked Diane for making me tea. I read the printout twice. Then I handed the phone back to Gracie and walked to the exterior wall of the workshop and pressed both palms flat against the cedar siding and stood there breathing until the anger settled into something I could carry. "How long?" I said. My voice came out even, which surprised me. "The concentration in the sample suggests it has been going on for at least a year," Gracie said. "Maybe longer. The full picture will need a blood panel from your doctor to establish the baseline, but this is enough." She paused. "This is more than enough." I turned around. She was standing in the gravel with the phone in her hand, and her jaw set, and her eyes clear, and she looked like someone who has just picked up a tool and recognized the weight of it and knows exactly what it is for. "I need to call Frank," I said. "Yes," she said. "And Warren?" She stopped. Started again. I am not leaving. I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, I am not picking up that bag again." I looked at my daughter standing in the November cold, in a flannel shirt she had borrowed from Peggy's bag, and work boots she had bought with the first $20 Pete had pressed into her hand at the end of her second week. And I thought about a 4-year-old girl who had thrown a wooden horse across a room because she wanted the blue one. "I know," I said. "I know you're not." I pulled out my phone and called Frank. He picked up on the first ring. "Lab results came back," I said. "Lorazepam. Confirmed." A pause. The sound of Frank setting something down on a hard surface. "Okay," he said. "Then we move. Tonight I need you. Gracie, Peggy, and Pete in the workshop after Diane goes to bed. Bring the lab result, the DNA report, the property photographs, and the envelope with the photograph. Bring everything." Another pause. "And Warren. Do not eat or drink anything in that house that you did not prepare yourself. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until this is over." I looked at the carafe sitting on the kitchen counter through the window. Diane was at the sink, her back to me washing a pan, with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who believes she has all the time in the world. "Understood," I said. We waited until 11:30. Diane went to bed at 10:15, the way she always did, a glass of water, the sound of the bathroom faucet, the light under her door going dark within 20 minutes. I had spent 15 years learning the rhythms of a person I did not actually know, and the one useful thing that knowledge gave me now was the certainty that once that light went out, she did not come back downstairs. Frank arrived at 11:40 parking on the far side of the tree line, where his truck would not show from the house windows. Pete had stayed late without being asked, the way Pete does things quietly, without requiring an explanation, just there when you needed him to be. Peggy was already in the workshop, sitting on a stool at the assembly table with a legal pad and a pen, because Peggy has always been the one in our family who understood that the way you get through something difficult is to write down what you know. Frank set his bag on the workbench and pulled out a laptop and a manila folder thick enough to require both hands. He laid everything out in order the way a man lays out tools before a job: the property photographs from the county recorder, the lab result, printout, the DNA report, the audio file from Ruth Hadley's recorder, transferred to a thumb drive, and finally a printed still image from a video, grainy and time-stamped, that he placed at the end of the row and said nothing about yet. I went through everything in sequence. The property fraud, first 6 agreements, 38% of the land, the 7th document waiting on a December signature. He explained each piece clearly, the way he explains things to people who need to understand, rather than people who need to be impressed. Peggy wrote steadily. Pete stood with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it does when he is angry and not going to say so. Then Frank opened the laptop and turned it toward me. "I need you to watch this," he said, "and I need you to tell me if you recognize the location." The footage was black and white, the timestamp reading April 14th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. It showed the forecourt of a gas station, two pump islands, a canopy with a light that threw hard shadows, a convenience store window to the right. In the upper left corner of the frame, partially obscured by the edge of the canopy, a figure sat hunched under the narrow overhang of the building's exterior wall. Dark clothing, knees drawn up, head down. A truck pulled into the forecourt. My truck. I watched myself climb out, walk to the pump, run my card. I knew the station. Route 18, about 40 minutes north of Millbrook. I stopped there coming back from the Portland Wood Products Expo every April, because it was the last full-service station before the long stretch of nothing between the highway and home. On the screen, the figure under the overhang stood up slowly. She was thin in the way of someone who has been thin for a long time, not by choice. She took 2 steps toward the pump island and stopped. Her head came up. On the screen. I reached into my back pocket, crossed to where she stood, handed her something, and walked back to my truck without looking at her face. The truck pulled out of the forecourt. The figure watched it go. Then she sat back down against the wall, drew her knees up again, and the footage ended. Nobody in the workshop said anything. I was aware of Gracie standing to my left. I was aware of her breathing, which had gone shallow and careful, the breathing of someone holding something very still inside themselves. "That was a $20 bill," I said. My voice came from somewhere far back in my chest. I remember stopping for gas. I do not remember her. "You didn't look at her face," Frank said. Not an accusation. Just a fact stated the way Frank states facts without decoration. "I was 3 steps away from my own daughter," I said. "In a parking lot. In the rain. And I got back in my truck." The workshop was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it that presses on the inside of your ears. Gracie reached over and put her hand over mine where it rested on the workbench. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The hand was enough warm and certain, the hand of someone who has decided not to hold a thing against you, even though they would have every right to. I turned my hand over and held hers, and looked at the frozen image on the laptop screen, a girl sitting against a gas station wall in the rain, while a truck drove away, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I set it down. "All right," I said. I looked around the table. Frank, Peggy, Pete, Gracie. "Tell me what we need to do." Frank laid out the plan in the same methodical way he had laid out the evidence. We needed Diane and Derek in the same location, believing they had won before we showed them otherwise. Warren would call Diane tomorrow morning and tell her he had been thinking about the woodshop, about getting his affairs in order, about making sure Brett was taken care of. He would suggest they meet at the workshop the following evening to talk through the final document. "She will bring Derek," Frank said. "She will want a witness. Maybe a lawyer if she can arrange it in time, but most likely Derek." "And Deputy Finch?" Peggy asked. "Already briefed," Frank said. "She will be on the property before Diane arrives, out of sight until we need her." I looked at Pete at the end of the table. He had not said a word through any of it. He was looking at the still image on the laptop, the girl against the wall, the truck pulling away with an expression I recognized, because I had seen it on his face once before, 15 years ago, the morning after the funeral, when he had come into the workshop and found me sitting on the floor and had not said a single word, just sat down next to me and stayed. "Pete," I said. He looked up. "I am going to need you there tomorrow night," I said. "As a witness. Will you do that?" Pete looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at Gracie. Then he nodded once slowly, the way he nods when a piece of work turns out to be worth doing. That was enough. I called Diane at 8:15 in the morning, while she was still in the kitchen making her own coffee. I could hear the percolator in the background when she picked up. The same percolator Sarah had complained about the morning of the day I found out she was sick. I had never thought about that before, that Diane had brought her own percolator into this house, and I had never once noticed it was not the same one. "Diane," I said, "do you have a minute?" "Of course." Her voice shifted into the register she used when she thought something was about to go her way. Warm, unhurried, the voice of a woman with patience to spare. "What is it?" I had practiced this the night before, lying on my back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running through it, until the words sat flat in my mouth and carried no more weight than a grocery list. I needed to sound like a man who had been worn down to a manageable size. A man who had thought it over and concluded that fighting was more trouble than it was worth. "I've been thinking," I said, "about the shop, about what happens to it." A pause not too long, just enough to sound like a man choosing words carefully, because they cost him something. "Brett has put in the time. I know I have not always made it easy for him. Maybe it is worth sitting down and talking through the paperwork, just the three of us, getting it settled before the end of the year." 3 seconds of silence on her end. I counted them. "I think that is very wise, Warren," she said. Her voice had gone careful in a way that sounded like warmth if you did not know what you were listening for. "I am glad you are thinking about this." "Tomorrow evening," I said. "At the shop. Say 7 o'clock. You and Brett can come over and we will look at whatever Frank drew up." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Should I bring anyone, a notary perhaps?" "Whatever makes you comfortable," I said. "I just want it done." She said she would arrange it. She said she was glad we were finally on the same page. She said she knew this had not been easy and that she appreciated my willingness to be reasonable. I listened to all of it and said the things that needed to be said and did not let any of what I was actually thinking come anywhere near my voice. When I hung up, I set the phone on the workbench and stood there for a moment with my hand over it, the way you stand over something after you have set it in motion and cannot take it back. Gracie appeared in the workshop doorway. She had been close enough to hear my side of the conversation. She raised her eyebrows. "She took it," I said. "I know." She looked at the phone under my hand. "How did that feel?" "Like lying," I said. Which it was. "You were lying to protect the truth," she said. "That is different." I was not entirely sure it was, but I did not argue the point. Frank arrived at noon and walked through the workshop with the eye of a man who has staged rooms before, not for comfort, but for consequence. He positioned the workbench where I would stand so that anyone entering from the main door would have to come fully into the room before they could see what was on it. He tested the acoustics by speaking from the doorway at normal volume and listening to how it carried. He had a small digital recorder that he taped to the underside of the bench lip oriented toward the space where Diane and Derek would stand. Deputy Carol Finch arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She drove an unmarked car and parked it behind the lumber shed where it would not show from the road or the house windows. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with close-cropped hair and the steady, slightly detached manner of someone who has seen enough that very little surprises her anymore. She had a copy of the lab report, a copy of the DNA result, and photographs of all 6 fraudulent property agreements in a folder under her arm. She shook my hand and looked around the workshop and said, "Nice setup." She meant the room. She did not mean it as a compliment, exactly more as a professional assessment of the conditions she would be working in. She went over the sequence with me twice. I would engage Diane and Derek in conversation. I would give them the opportunity to make incriminating statements on record, specifically any acknowledgement of the property agreements or the original arrangement with the nurse. When Frank signaled from the side door, she would come in. What if they do not say anything useful? I asked. Then we charge them on the documents, she said. The property fraud alone is a Class C felony. The nurse situation is more complex, but Ruth Hadley's recorded statement and notarized confession give us a strong foundation. She looked at me steadily. We have enough, Mr. Cole. Tonight is about giving them the opportunity to add to it. But we do not need them to confess. I found that more reassuring than I expected. By 6 o'clock, the workshop was ready. Pete was inside at the far bench, pretending to work on a cabinet door. Peggy was in the office with the door cracked. Gracie was in the back room, her room with the door closed, because we had agreed that her presence was a card we would play at the right moment and not before. Frank was outside in the tree line with his phone and a clear line of sight to the main door. I stood in the middle of the workshop floor and looked at the space around me. The smell of Douglas fir and machine oil. The Douglas fir plank floor my father had put down 60 years ago that I had refinished 3 times. The sign above the door that read Cole and Sons in letters I had painted myself the year I took over the business and did not yet know what the Sons was going to mean. Headlights came up the drive at 7:02. I heard a car door, then another. Then the sound of footsteps on gravel. Diane's particular walk, the one I had learned over 15 years, heel-toe, deliberate and unhurried. I pulled in one breath and let it out slow. Then I opened the door. Before I reveal the final confrontation and expose the entire truth, type "still here" or the number 15 in the comments, so I know you're standing with me. And please note, the next part of the story includes dramatized details that may not be strictly factual. If that's not what you're looking for, feel free to drop off here. Diane walked in first, wearing her dark wool coat and carrying her usual mask of calm control. Brett came in right behind her, looking pale and nervous, followed by a lawyer Diane had hired to notarize the forged land transfer. Derek Sloan wasn't stupid enough to show his face in person. He was waiting in a car down the road, unaware that Deputy Finch's backup unit had already blocked the driveway. I was standing in the middle of the room with the workbench behind me and my hands at my sides. "Warren," Diane said. Warm, pleased, the voice of a woman arriving at something she has earned. "I am glad you called. Come on in," I said. "Shut the door behind you." Brett shut the door. The 3 of them stood in a loose group near the entrance and looked at me, and I looked back at them and did not say anything for a moment, because I wanted them fully inside the room before I said anything at all. Frank had been clear about that. Get them away from the exit. Get them committed to the space. Then I stepped to the side. Behind me on the workbench, laid out in a row under the overhead light, was everything. The DNA report. The lab result with the lorazepam finding. 6 photographs of the fraudulent property agreements, each one enlarged to letter size so the forged signatures were plainly visible. The printed transcript of Ruth Hadley's notarized confession. And in the center, the thumb drive containing the audio file, Ruth's voice and Diane's voice on it, clear and unhurried, 15 years old and perfectly preserved on a digital recorder that a dying woman had kept in a fireproof safe because she understood that someday someone would need to hear it. I watched Diane's eyes move across the workbench. I watched the warmth go out of her face the way heat goes out of a room when you open a window in November. "I am not signing anything tonight," I said. "I called you here because I wanted to look at you when you understood that it was over." Derek took a step toward the side door. Frank stepped out of the shadows beside it before Derek's second foot came down. "Don't," Frank said. One word. Derek stopped. Brett did not move at all. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the workbench and then at his mother. And something passed over his face that I did not have a name for. Not guilt, exactly. Not relief, exactly. something in between those two things that had been waiting a long time to surface. Deputy Carol Finch came through the main door. She had her badge on her belt and a calm procedural manner that made the room feel smaller and more serious simultaneously. She looked at the workbench, looked at Diane, looked at Derek. "Ma'am," she said to Diane. "Sir," to Derek. "I am going to need you both to keep your hands where I can see them." Diane turned to me. The composure was still there, which I had expected. Diane had been composing herself in difficult rooms for a long time. "This is a mistake," she said. "Whatever that woman told you, whatever she signed, she was ill and she was confused, and a jury will see that." "She was ill," I said. "She was also recorded. 15 years ago, in a conversation she had with you, in which you gave her specific instructions about what to do with my daughter. Your voice, Diane. On a recorder she kept because she was afraid of what you might do if she ever told the truth." Diane looked at the thumb drive on the workbench. Something moved behind her eyes and then went still. Carol was already moving standard procedure, calm and efficient, the way a person does a job they have done before. She told Diane and Derek they were being detained for questioning in connection with property fraud, falsification of legal documents, and additional charges pending review. She told them they had the right to remain silent and that anything they said could be used against them in court. She told them they had the right to an attorney. Brett said, "I'll cooperate." His voice was flat without inflection, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of second-guessing it. He looked at Carol and held out his wrists. Diane looked at her son, at the person she had arranged her entire scheme around, the person for whom she had spent 15 years dismantling other people's lives, and the expression on her face when he held out his wrists was something I did not expect. It was not anger. It was not betrayal. It was a kind of erasure, as if she was already revising the story she would tell about this moment into something she could manage. She turned to me one last time. "That girl," she said, "will never be a Cole. She is nobody. She came from nothing, and she will go back to nothing the moment a judge looks at what she really is." The door of the back room opened. Gracie came out. She walked across the workshop floor and stopped beside me close enough that her shoulder was an inch from mine, and she looked at Diane with the steady, clear-eyed look she had given me the morning she held a jar of tea up to the kitchen light and told me what she saw in it. "You're right that I came from nothing," she said. "I came from a gas station parking lot in the rain. I came from a shelter floor in January. I came from 2 years of eating what other people were going to throw away." Her voice was level and unhurried, and carried in the workshop, the way a voice carries in a space built to hold the sound of tools. "But I also came from this shop, from the man who built it. And the only reason I was ever out there in the rain instead of in here is because of what you did." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You did not take me away from nothing," she said. "You took me away from this, and you failed." Carol led Diane out first. Derek followed without being told. Brett walked out on his own, not looking at anyone, and I had the sense of a person moving from one chapter of their life into another, with a clarity that was going to cost them a great deal, and might in the end be worth it. I stood in the doorway of Cole and Sons and watched the taillights of Carol's car until they reached the end of the drive and turned onto the road. Then I stepped back inside where the light was on, and the smell of Douglas fir was everywhere, and my daughter was standing in the middle of the workshop floor. Frank called at 9 the next morning. I was in the workshop, not working, just standing at the bench with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the place where the evidence had been laid out the night before. The workbench was empty now. Pete had cleared it before he left, stacking everything into a folder that Frank had taken with him when Carol drove away. The bench looked the way it always looked, which was strange. 15 years of a certain kind of wrong, and a workbench that looked exactly the same as it always had. Gracie was sweeping the far end of the workshop. She had been in at 5:30 again, the way she always was. I stepped outside to take the call. Brett talked, Frank said. Voluntarily. No attorney present, Miranda rights waived in writing. Carol witnessed it. He talked for an hour and 40 minutes. I leaned against the exterior wall and looked at the Douglas firs and said, "Tell me." Frank told me that Brett Mercer was not Diane Mercer's biological son. He had known this since he was 16 years old, when he found a set of documents in a box in Diane's closet that he had been looking through because he needed his birth certificate for a school form and did not know where else to look. What he found instead was an adoption record from the state of Nevada dated when he was 8 years old, listing Diane Mercer as adoptive parent and a child named Brett Allen Caulfield as the subject. He had put the documents back and never asked Diane about them directly. He had waited the way a child waits when they have learned that asking certain questions leads to consequences they are not equipped to handle. 3 months later, when he was sure he had the timing right, he brought it up sideways, mentioned Nevada at dinner, watched her face. Diane had looked at him for a long moment, and then said very calmly that some things were better left where they were, and that she had given him everything he needed and expected the same in return. That had been the shape of their relationship from that point forward. She picked him up from a children's home in Reno, Frank said. 8 years old, no family, no prospects. She needed a child to make the approach to Warren look like what she wanted it to look like, a widow with a son starting over looking for stability. Brett was the right age, the right presentation. I thought about a boy of 8 being selected for his presentation. I thought about what that does to a person over the course of 20 years. He knew what she was doing, I said. It was not a question. Not at first. He figured it out gradually, the way you figure out things you do not want to know, piece by piece. Each piece giving you the option to stop looking, and you keep looking anyway, because some part of you needs to know the shape of the thing you are living inside. Frank paused. By the time he was 18, he understood most of it. By the time he was 22, he understood all of it. And he stayed. She had things on him, Frank said. Small things from when he was a teenager, some money that went missing from a neighbor, a car that got damaged and was never reported. Nothing that would survive serious legal scrutiny, but enough to make a young man with no family and no safety net feel like the cost of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. I drank the last of my cold coffee and stared at the tree line. I thought about Gracie at 19 signing papers she did not fully understand because a man told her he believed in her and she had never had anyone believe in her before. I thought about what it costs a person to make decisions from inside a life that has not given them many options. I thought about the difference between culpable and trapped and how those two things are not always as far apart as the law needs them to be. He is going to testify, Frank said. Full cooperation. Carol thinks the DA will offer a plea probation, no jail time restitution. The property agreements will be voided by the court. All 6 of them plus the 7th that was never executed. The land stays with Cole and Sons. I nodded, though Frank could not see it. What about the boy? I said. After all this. A pause. That is not really my department, Warren. No, I said. I know it is not. I went back inside. Gracie had moved from sweeping to organizing the hand tool wall, taking each tool down, wiping it clean, hanging it back in its place with the same careful attention she gave everything. She did not look up when I came in, which meant she was giving me space, which was something I had noticed she was good at understanding when a person needed to be inside their own head for a minute before they came back to the room. I stood at the bench and watched her work and thought about what Frank had said. A boy of 8 selected for his presentation. A boy of 16 finding documents in a box and putting them back and waiting. A boy of 22 who understood the shape of the thing he was living inside and stayed anyway because the cost of leaving felt too high. I had spent 15 years thinking of Brett Mercer as an extension of Diane, a piece of the machinery she had built inside my house, and he had been that. But he had also been something else, a child who was handed to a woman who needed a prop and had spent 20 years trying to figure out what that made him. "Gracie," I said. She turned around. "The agreements are being voided," I said. "The land stays, all of it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back to the tool wall and took down a draw knife and wiped it carefully with the cloth she was holding. "Good," she said. "Pete will be pleased. He has strong feelings about that kiln." I laughed. It came out of somewhere I had not accessed in a long time, sudden and real, and it felt like a door opening in a room that had been closed for 15 years. Gracie glanced back at me over her shoulder, and one corner of her mouth lifted, and she turned back to the tool wall, and we stayed like that. Her working, me standing the workshop around us, full of Douglas fir and machine oil, and the particular quality of December light coming through the east windows for a long time. The Millbrook bus stop is not much to look at. It is a covered bench on the south side of Main Street with a schedule board that gets updated when someone remembers to update it, and a trash can that the wind tips over roughly twice a week. I had driven past it 10,000 times in 30 years without ever having a reason to stop there. I pulled the truck up to the curb at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning and cut the engine, and Gracie got out before I did, the way she did everything a half step ahead, already oriented toward what needed doing. The bus from Portland arrived 4 minutes late, which Pete later told me was actually early for that route. Nina was the third person off. I recognized her from the way Gracie moved toward her, the particular acceleration of someone closing the last few feet toward a person they have been worried about and are relieved to see intact. Nina was 22 slight, with the watchful economy of movement that comes from spending time in places where being unnoticed is an advantage. She had a backpack and a canvas tote bag, and the expression of someone who has agreed to something they are not entirely sure about, but is committed to seeing through. She looked at Gracie. Then she looked at me. "You're the father," she said. "Not a question. Not unfriendly. Just establishing coordinates." "Warren Cole," I said, and held out my hand. She looked at the hand for a moment. A beat longer than social convention requires the beat of a person who has learned to take a reading before they commit, and then she shook it. Her grip was firm and brief and told me nothing except that she had decided to give this a chance. We drove back to the shop with Nina in the passenger seat and Gracie behind us, and Nina asked about the trees, and I told her about Douglas fir and western red cedar, and the difference between what each one is good for, which was probably more than she wanted to know, but she listened without interrupting, which I took as a reasonable sign. Pete was waiting in the workshop when we arrived. He looked at Nina the way Pete looks at everything, without appearing to look at all, cataloging quietly from the periphery. He poured coffee from the pot on the filing cabinet into a mug that said Portland Trail Blazers on the side, the one he gave to visitors because it was the one he cared least about, and handed it to Nina without asking whether she wanted any. She took it. Another reasonable sign. Pete sat down on his stool at the assembly table and began to talk. Not about the case, not about Diane, not about any of the things that had happened in the past 3 months. He talked about the workshop, about the Douglas fir planks in the floor and how they had been milled 60 years ago when the previous owner built the place and what it took to keep them from warping in Oregon winters. He talked about the difference between green wood and seasoned wood and why patience matters more than strength in this trade. He talked about a cabinet he was building for a family in town, a commission he had been working on for 3 months, how the joined corners were the part that would last longest, and also the part nobody ever noticed unless they went looking. Nina sat on a spare stool with the Trailblazers mug in both hands and listened. She asked one question about the wood for the cabinet. What kind? And Pete told her. White oak quarter sawn, and explained what quarter sawn meant and why it mattered, and she nodded, the way a person nods when they are actually absorbing something, rather than waiting for their turn to talk. Gracie was at the far bench, fitting a new handle onto a draw knife that had lost its original to a crack in the wood. She was not watching Nina. She was giving her room, which was exactly right. After about 40 minutes, Nina set the mug down on the bench and looked across the workshop at Gracie. She looks like she belongs here, Nina said. Not to Pete, not to me specifically, just to the room. She does, Pete said. Nina was quiet for a moment. I watched her take in the workshop, the tools on the wall, the lumber stacked in order of species and dimension, the December light coming flat and silver through the east windows. Gracie fitting the handle with her head bent and her hands certain. Then she turned to me. At St. Margaret's, she said. When we were about 12, Gracie used to talk in her sleep sometimes. Not words, just sounds. Like she was answering someone. I used to think it was strange. She looked back at Gracie. I think I understand it better now. I did not say anything to that. Some things do not need a response so much as a witness. Peggy came in from his office with her coat on, keys in hand, and introduced herself to Nina with the directness that Peggy brings to everything. And within 6 minutes, she had determined that Nina needed a warmer jacket for Oregon winters, that the room above Sam Greer's garage had been empty since his nephew moved out in September, and that Sam would rent it for a reasonable figure if someone asked him properly. Pete knows Sam, Peggy said, looking at Pete. Everybody in Millbrook knows Sam, Pete said. Nina looked at Peggy, then at Pete, then at me. There was something shifting behind her eyes that I recognized, not conversion, not sudden belief, just the recalibration of a person who has built a set of expectations based on the available evidence and is now encountering evidence that does not fit the model. Is it always like this here? She said. Like what? Gracie asked from the far bench, not looking up. Nina looked around the workshop one more time. At Pete with his coffee. At Peggy with her keys. At the floor that had been there for 60 years. At the tools hung in order on the wall. Never mind, she said. But the corner of her mouth had moved just slightly in a direction that was going to take some getting used to, but was clearly headed somewhere good. I went back to the bench. I had been pretending to work at all morning, and picked up the piece I had been shaping, a small walnut box. Nothing special, something to do with my hands, and felt the grain under my fingers, and thought that this was a Tuesday in December in Millbrook, Oregon, and my daughter was 20 feet away, fitting a draw knife handle, and Pete was explaining quarter-sawn oak to a girl from Portland who was drinking coffee from the Trailblazers mug. It was without question the best Tuesday I had experienced in 15 years. I have been coming out to the workshop before sunrise for 30 years. It started the winter. I bought the place when I was 32 years old, and terrified of what I had taken on, and found that the only way to quiet that terror was to get up before the rest of the world and stand in the space that was mine, and learn its sounds and its smells, and the way the cold settled into the lumber overnight. It became a habit. Then it became something else, the part of the day that belonged only to me, before the phone rang, and the deliveries came, and the ordinary demands of a business started pulling in every direction. This morning I came out at 5, and the workshop was dark and smelled of Douglas fir and machine oil and the cold that had come down from the mountains overnight. I stood in the middle of the floor and breathed it in and thought, there is no smell in the world like a working woodshop in December. Then I heard the door behind me, footsteps on the plank floor, unhurried, certain, the footsteps of someone who has learned where the boards creak and how to step around them. A presence at my shoulder, close enough that I could hear her breathing in the dark. I did not turn around. "You're up early," I said. "You're always up early," Gracie said. "I've been watching the schedule." I reached over and flipped the overheads on. The workshop came up in the slow way fluorescents do in cold weather, a flicker, a hesitation, then the full light settling over the lumber racks and the tool wall and the floor my father had put down 6 decades ago. Gracie was standing beside me in the flannel shirt she had taken to wearing every morning, her hair still pushed back from sleep hands in the front pocket of her jeans. She was looking at the sign above the main door, Cole & Sons, in the letters I had painted myself 30 years ago, when I did not yet know what the Sons was going to mean. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. When you painted that sign, did you think you were going to have a son?" I looked at the sign. I thought about the man I had been at 32, standing in this same space with wet paint on my hands, thinking about the future in the way you think about it when you are young enough to believe it is something you can plan. "I thought I was going to have children," I said. "Plural. A houseful. That was the plan." I looked at the letters. "Plans change." "Do you want to change the sign?" she asked. I looked at her. She was looking at it with the particular expression she had when she was measuring something, not judging, just taking accurate account of what was in front of her. "Not today," I said. "Let's go to work." Pete arrived at 6. Sam Greer came by at 7 with a paper bag of biscuits from the diner, still warm, and set them on the corner of the workbench without ceremony, and went back to his truck, which was becoming normal, which amounted to the same thing. Peggy came out at 7:30 with coffee and stayed to talk to Pete about the white oak cabinet. Pete showed her the joined corners. Peggy said it was beautiful. Pete said it was adequate, which from Pete meant exactly the same thing. I set Gracie up at the hand tool bench with a piece of cherry. I had been saving straight grain, no knots, the kind of piece you give someone when you want to see what they can do with something that deserves doing right. I told her I wanted a small box, nothing complicated. Dovetail corners if she felt ready, no rush. She picked up the cherry and turned it in her hands, holding it up to the overhead light and looking along the grain, the way I had shown her, the way Pete had shown me, the way an old carpenter in Eugene had shown Pete 40 years ago. Then she set it down and picked up a marking gauge and began. I went back to the walnut box I had been working on since Tuesday and did not watch her because some things go better without an audience. We worked through the morning without talking much, which is the right way to work in a shop. The sounds were the sounds a workshop makes when it is being used properly. The draw of a handsaw, the tap of a mallet, the whisper of a plane taking a thin shaving off the face of a board. Outside the east windows, the December light moved across the floor in the slow way it moves in Oregon, in this time of year, gray, going to silver, going to pale gold. At some point I looked up. Gracie was holding the cherry piece in both hands, looking at it the way a person looks at something they have made and are not yet sure whether it is what they intended. The way her thumbs ran along the grain before she committed to anything. The way she held the piece slightly away from her body to read it in the light. It was the same way I held a piece. The same way my father had held a piece And he had taught me without knowing he was teaching me the way most things worth knowing get passed along. She looked up and caught me watching. I looked back down at my work. "How does it feel?" I said. "Like something I already knew how to do," she said, "which is strange." "Not strange," I said. "Not strange at all." The afternoon came on, and Pete finished the white oak cabinet and stood back and looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his flannel, took out a black marker, thick-tipped permanent, the kind he used to label lumber, and walked to the sign above the workshop door. Cole and Sons. He uncapped the marker and drew a careful line under the word Sons, underlined it. Put the cap back on, dropped the marker in his pocket, and turned around. "Now that's right," he said. "To nobody in particular. To all of us." I looked at the sign. I looked at Gracie, who was looking at the sign with her cherry piece in her hands, and something on her face I did not have a name for yet, but recognized as the beginning of one. I turned back to my bench, picked up the walnut box corner's joined lid, fitted just the finishing left, ran my thumb along the grain the way my father had, the way I did, the way she was already doing without being told. Outside, the December light was going gold on the plank floor. Inside, the workshop smelled of Douglas fir and machine oil and cherry wood, and the particular warmth of a room being used for exactly what it was built for. For the first time in 15 years, I did not want the day to end. I am not a man who talks much. Never have been. But tonight, standing in this workshop where everything began and everything came back, I feel like I owe you something honest. I lost 15 years because I trusted the wrong person and stopped trusting myself. I handed over my mail, my mornings, my clarity, one small thing at a time until I had nothing left to question with. Don't do what I did. Don't let grief make your decisions. Don't let loneliness choose your company. And don't wait 15 years to ask the questions that have been sitting in your chest all along. I believe God puts people at the right table at the right moment. A hungry girl asked for my leftovers, and it turned out she was the answer to a prayer I had stopped saying out loud. That is my family story. It is not a clean one. But it is mine and she is mine, and this workshop, Cole and Sons, is ours now. If these grandpa stories have moved you in any way, if something in this family story reminded you of your own father, your own daughter, your own unanswered questions, leave a comment below and tell me. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. One more thing before you go: the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and for the heart. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.